When I drove up the gravel road to my family ranch that morning, I couldn't believe what I saw. My quiet green pastures, where my bulls usually grazed in peace, were covered with tents, hundreds of them. Campfires smoked, music blared, and strangers stomped across my land as if it were their personal playground. Cars jammed the dirt driveway, kids ran through my hayfields, and beer cans sparkled in the sunlight. At the center of it all stood Karen, the loudmouth president of the HOA, wearing a smug grin like she owned the place. She waved at me and shouted, "Welcome to our big neighborhood camping festival." My stomach turned cold. I had never given anyone permission to step foot here. That's when I realized she had invited nearly 1,000 people to trespass on my property, and she had no idea what was about to happen next. The morning started out like any other, crisp and full of the kind of calm you only find miles away from the nearest highway. A thin mist hovered above the rolling pasture, softening the edges of the fences my grandfather had built decades ago. Sunlight was just starting to spill across the hills, painting everything in warm shades of gold. This land had been in my family for generations, a sanctuary where the outside world couldn't intrude. Most weekends I drove out from the city to breathe in the clean air, check on my bulls, and let the stress of deadlines and traffic fall away. That Saturday, I expected nothing more than a day of repairs, feeding, and maybe an evening of quiet by the fire. I didn't know it yet, but the peaceful life I loved was about to be stomped on by the most outrageous trespass I had ever witnessed. That as I turned my truck off the county road and onto the long gravel driveway, I noticed the first sign that something was wrong. Instead of the familiar sound of crunching gravel and distant bird song, a faint thumping reached my ears. It was steady, rhythmic like bass from a giant speaker. At first, I thought maybe one of the neighbors was having an early party, but my nearest neighbor lived a full mile away, and I'd never heard music carry this far. I slowed the truck and rolled down the window. The thump grew louder, joined by the faint crackle of laughter and the unmistakable buzz of voices. My brow tightened. Out here, on a quiet Saturday morning, that kind of noise didn't belong. The driveway curved through a thick stand of pines before opening to the wide meadow that made up the heart of my property. As the trees thinned, my stomach dropped. Where there should have been empty pasture and grazing bulls, there was a sea of color and chaos. Tens, dozens at first glance. Then hundreds, as I took it all in, were scattered across the field like a festival had sprouted overnight. Bright nylon canopies flapped in the breeze, campfires smoked, and people milled about in every direction. Cars and trucks were parked haphazardly along the fence line, blocking my access road and even cutting ruts into the soil I worked so hard to maintain. Children darted between vehicles, waving sparklers despite the morning light, while adults lounged in folding chairs with drinks in hand. Music blared from several giant speakers, their cords snaking across the grass like careless traps. For a full minute, I sat frozen behind the wheel, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. This was my land. I hadn't invited anyone, and there were clearly snow. At least 1,000 strangers occupying it like it was a public park. Anger surged up my spine, hot and sharp. I slammed the truck into park and stepped out, the gravel crunching under my boots as I marched toward the nearest cluster of tents. A few people glanced at me, offering casual smiles as though I were just another camper joining the fun. One man even raised a beer and shouted, "Welcome to the festival." My fists clenched. Who in the world thought they could turn my private ranch into a party ground? That's when I heard her voice, sharp, commanding, and unmistakable. "Oh, look who finally decided to join us." Across the field, standing on a makeshift platform of wooden crates, was Karen. If trouble had a human form in our community, it was her. Karen was the self-appointed queen of the neighboring HOA, a woman whose mission in life seemed to be enforcing rules that didn't apply to her and inserting herself into business that wasn't hers. I had dealt with her before petty complaints about the eyesore of my farm equipment, fake claims that my bulls were dangerous wildlife, and endless attempts to rope my property into the HOA, despite the fact that it was legally exempt. But this was beyond anything I could have imagined. Karen spotted me and waved dramatically, as if we were old friends. Her wide-brimmed sun hat glinted with sequins that caught the morning light, and her grin was as smug as ever. "Isn't it wonderful?" she called, her voice carrying easily over the music. "Our first annual neighborhood camping festival. Everyone's having such a great time." My boots dug into the damp soil as I stomped toward her, weaving through clusters of laughing strangers who clearly had no idea they were trespassing. A man in a tie-dye shirt offered me a plate of pancakes from a griddle balanced on a cooler. The smell of maple syrup and sizzling bacon twisted my stomach, not from hunger, but from outrage. When I finally reached Karen's platform, I looked up at her and forced my voice to stay steady. "Karen, what the hell is going on here? This is my property. None of you have permission to be here." Karen tilted her head in mock innocence. "Oh, don't be so dramatic," she said, her voice dripping with fake sweetness. "This land is basically part of the neighborhood. The old HOA maps show it as shared green space." I felt my jaw tighten. "That's a lie, and you know it. My grandfather bought this ranch decades before your HOA even existed. I have the deed. This land is private." She gave a little shrug, as if my words were nothing more than a light breeze. "Maybe, but people needed a place to gather, and your pasture was just sitting here, Empty. I thought you wouldn't mind if we borrowed it for the weekend. After all, it's for the community. Borrow it. My fists curled at my sides. She had the nerve to borrow my land by inviting 1,000 strangers to trample it. I took a deep breath, trying to keep my temper in check. You're trespassing, I said firmly. All of you. You need to shut this down and leave now. Karen's grin only widened. Relax, cowboy. We'll be gone by Sunday evening. No harm done. Besides, everyone's having such a wonderful time. Why spoil the fun? Behind her, a group of teenagers set off a string of fireworks, the loud pops echoing through the valley. My bulls penned up in a corral near the barn let out nervous snorts at the sound. My heart pounded. This wasn't just a nuisance. It was dangerous. Bulls could spook easily, and a single loose animal could injure someone or worse. I imagined the lawsuits, the damage to my property, the risk to my animals. Karen's careless arrogance could get someone hurt. I pulled my phone from my pocket and dialed the sheriff's office. As the line rang, I turned my back on Karen, unwilling to give her the satisfaction of seeing my frustration. A calm but tired dispatcher answered. I explained the situation as quickly as I could. Hundreds of trespassers, property damage, fireworks, and a known instigator named Karen. The dispatcher sighed, apologizing. It was a busy holiday weekend, and all available deputies were already responding to accidents and disturbances. They could send someone, but it might be hours before help arrived. Hours. My eyes scanned the field, taking in the growing chaos. More cars were arriving, engines rumbling as they pulled onto my pasture and crushed the tender grass. Children chased each other dangerously close to the electric fence, and smoke from multiple campfires drifted toward the barn where dry hay was stored. I couldn't wait hours. By then, my land could be a disaster zone. I turned back to Karen, who was now basking in the attention of a group of parents thanking her for organizing such a wonderful event. My blood boiled. She caught my eye and gave me a little wave, as if daring me to stop her. For a brief second, I considered wading into the crowd and shutting off the speakers myself. But I knew that would only spark more confrontation. These weren't just neighbors, they were strangers, emboldened by numbers and alcohol. I needed a plan that would clear them out fast, something that would make them leave of their own accord. That's when I glanced toward the barn and saw the heavy wooden gate of the bullpen, still secured but quivering slightly as my animals shifted restlessly inside. My prize bulls were massive, strong, and fiercely territorial. They hated loud noises and sudden movement. I could almost feel their agitation from across the field. An idea flickered in my mind wild. Dangerous, but tempting. If these trespassers wanted excitement, maybe my bulls could give them a reason to pack up and run. Of course, I wouldn't let anyone get hurt. I knew my animals well enough to control them if things got too far, but a little stampede might send a message louder than any sheriff's deputy could. The thought made me pause. I wasn't a reckless man. My grandfather had raised me to respect both people and animals. Yet as I looked at the crushed grass, the trampled flowers near the fence, and the careless way strangers treated the land that meant everything to me, a slow, fierce resolve took root. Karen thought she could use my property as her personal playground. She thought the law couldn't touch her. But out here, on my land, there were older rules of respect and boundaries, enforced not by paperwork, but by sheer force of nature. I took one last look at the chaos in the field, the music, the fireworks, the children running wild. Then I turned toward the barn, my boots sinking into the damp earth with each step. The bulls were waiting, and so was the justice Karen didn't even see coming. The barn smelled of fresh hay, leather, and the sharp musk of restless animals. The moment I stepped inside, the noise from the field dulled to a distant throb, like a storm rumbling on the horizon. My bulls were awake and agitated. 6 massive animals shifted inside their heavy steel pen hooves, scraping against the packed dirt floor. Their snorts echoed against the wooden beams, low and guttural, each breath a cloud of steam in the cool morning air. Normally, they were powerful but predictable. Today, they moved with a tense energy, tails flicking and eyes flashing with a spark I hadn't seen in months. The distant bass of the music outside vibrated through the walls, making the wooden boards hum. They felt it too. I paused at the gate, resting one gloved hand on the cold metal latch. For a moment I let myself breathe, inhaling the scent of hay and dust that always reminded me of my grandfather. He used to say, "Respect the animal, and it will respect you. Break that trust, and you've already lost." His words rang in my ears now, steady and grounding. I wasn't here to hurt anyone, not the bulls and not the fools outside. But something had to be done before this mob turned my ranch into a disaster zone. I walked slowly along the pen, running my hand across the rail. Each bull turned to watch me, their dark eyes alert. King, the largest of the group, stamped his hoof and tossed his head, the muscles in his neck rippling. He weighed nearly 2,000 pounds, a wall of muscle and bone that could crush a man without trying. Behind him, the younger bulls mirrored his tension, shifting their weight and flicking their ears at every sharp sound. They were ready for action, they just needed a signal. Outside, the party was growing louder. I heard a sharp crack as another firework burst, followed by a shrill chorus of cheers. My jaw tightened. Karen was still out there, no doubt basking in the chaos she'd unleashed. I pictured her smug grin as she accepted praise for organizing this illegal festival. The thought made my blood burn. I pulled out my phone and checked for a call from the sheriff. Nothing. Still no sign of help. I could wait. But every minute meant more damage, more ruts in the soil, more trash in the creek, more risk of someone wandering near the bulls and getting hurt. Waiting wasn't an option anymore. I crossed to the far corner of the barn where the feed bins were, STORED, and grabbed a bucket of grain. The bulls perked up immediately, heads lifting as the smell of sweet feed filled the air. Normally, grain meant breakfast. Today, it meant focus. I shook the bucket lightly, letting the rattle of kernels echo in the barn. "Easy, boys," I said softly. "Not yet. Just hold on." Their ears flicked toward me, sharp and attentive. They trusted my voice. That trust would be the key to what came next. I stepped back to the gate and studied the heavy chain looped through the latch. It was strong, the kind of chain my grandfather used when he wanted absolute security. I ran my fingers over the links, feeling the cool steel. Releasing them wouldn't be difficult. I had the key in my pocket. The hard part would be controlling what happened next. These bulls were trained for rodeo shows and ranch work, but once startled, they could move like a force of nature. If I let them out, they wouldn't attack. That wasn't their way. But their size alone would terrify anyone foolish enough to be in their path. I hesitated, my grandfather's warning echoing in my mind. Never use an animal to fight your battles. Was that what I was doing? Maybe. But this wasn't about revenge, it was about protection. My land, my animals, and even the trespassers outside were in danger if this chaos continued. I wasn't unleashing violence. I was letting nature do the talking. I tightened my grip on the bucket and unlocked the chain. The gate creaked as I eased it open, the sound barely audible over the pounding music outside. King snorted and stepped forward, nostrils flaring. I raised my free hand and gave a low whistle, the signal we'd trained for during exercises. The bulls knew it meant follow. Slowly, deliberately, I backed toward the open barn door. 6 pairs of hooves shuffled behind me, heavy and rhythmic. Dust rose in soft clouds around us. Outside, the sunlight hit my eyes in a blinding flash. The field stretched out before me, a chaotic scene of tents, coolers, and laughing strangers who had no idea what was about to enter their party. I guided the bulls to the edge of the barnyard and paused, letting them sniff the air. Their ears flicked toward the noise, muscles tense and ready. King tossed his head again, a low bellow rumbling from deep in his chest. It was a sound that cut through the music like a blade. A few nearby campers turned, confusion flashing across their faces as they spotted the massive shapes emerging from the barn. The first screams came seconds later. Someone shouted, "Bulls! Oh my God, there are bulls!" Panic spread like fire. People jumped from their chairs, spilling drinks and knocking over tables. A group of teenagers dropped their frisbee and bolted toward the cars, tripping over tent ropes in their rush. The music faltered as someone fumbled with the speakers, then cut off entirely, leaving only the thunder of hooves as the bulls moved forward. I stayed a few feet behind King, keeping my voice calm and steady. "Easy, boys, just a stroll." The bulls responded perfectly, spreading out across the field in a slow but powerful march. They didn't charge. They didn't need to. Their sheer size and presence were enough to send people fleeing. Tents collapsed as campers yanked out stakes and grabbed their belongings in frantic haste. Cars revved as drivers scrambled to escape, tires spitting gravel and dirt. Karen's reaction was everything I expected and more. She stood near her makeshift stage, frozen with a mix of outrage and disbelief. Her wide-brimmed hat tilted askew as she pointed a trembling finger at me. "You can't do this," she screeched, her voice cracking. "This is animal endangerment. I'll sue you." I didn't answer. Instead, I kept my eyes on the bulls, guiding them with quiet whistles and hand signals. They moved like a living wall, sweeping across the meadow in a slow arc that drove the crowd toward the fence line. No one dared challenge them. Parents scooped up children, teenagers scrambled over fences, and grown men tripped over coolers in their rush to get away. The once loud festival now echoed with the sounds of panic, shouts, slamming car doors, and the relentless thunder of hooves on grass. The bulls stopped when they reached the far edge of the field, turning back toward me for their next command. I gave a sharp whistle and pointed toward the barn. Obedient as trained soldiers, they pivoted and began the steady walk back, their heavy breathing mixing with the fading cries of the fleeing crowd. Within minutes, the meadow that had been a circus of tents and music was nearly empty. Only a few abandoned chairs and scattered trash remained. Karen, however, hadn't moved. Mud splattered her white sneakers as she stomped toward me, face red with fury. "This isn't over," she shouted. "You think you can scare people away with your animals? I'll have the sheriff on you before sunset." I met her glare with a calm I didn't quite feel. "Good," I said evenly. "I already called the sheriff hours ago. You can explain to them why you trespassed on private property, tore down my signs, and endangered over 1,000 people." Her mouth opened and closed like a fish, but no words came out. Behind her, a few stragglers gathered their belongings and sprinted to their cars. The rumble of departing engines filled the air until only silence remained, broken only by the soft snorts of my bulls as they settled back into the barnyard. For the first time all morning, I allowed myself to breathe. The bulls had done exactly what I needed. No injuries, no damage, just a message loud enough to clear the field. I led them back into the barn, closing the gate with a final clang of the chain. King turned his massive head toward me, dark eyes calm once more. I reached through the rail and patted his thick neck. "Good job, big guy," I murmured. "You saved the day." Outside, the meadow lay scarred with tire tracks and scattered litter, but it was empty. The air smelled of trampled grass and extinguished campfires, a sharp contrast to the chaos that had filled it only minutes before. Karen lingered near the gate, still sputtering with indignation, but she no longer looked like the queen of a grand festival. Her sequined hat was bent, her sneakers caked with mud, and her voice carried none of its usual authority. I walked past her without a word, heading for my truck. There was still work to do, calls to make, fences to inspect, and a sheriff to meet. But the worst was over. The bulls had spoken, and the trespassers had heard. For now, the ranch was mine again. Behind me, Karen shouted one last empty threat about lawyers and lawsuits, but her voice barely reached me over the sound of gravel crunching under my boots. I didn't bother turning back. Let her scream. Out here, words meant little. Actions and a herd of determined bulls spoke far louder than any HOA president ever could. As I climbed into my truck, I caught one final glimpse of King standing proud at the barn door, chest broad and eyes steady. He was more than an animal. He was a reminder of what my grandfather always taught me. Nature doesn't bow to arrogance. It protects its own, and today, it had protected me. The sun had risen high by the time the last echo of engines faded down the gravel road. A hush settled over the ranch, the kind of quiet that comes after a storm. Bits of trash fluttered across the meadow like defeated flags, crushed paper cups, plastic plates, scraps of glittery decorations. The grass was matted and scarred with deep tire ruts, and the acrid smell of burnt fireworks lingered in the warming air. My bulls were back in their pen.com and content, chewing hay as if nothing extraordinary had happened. From the barnyard, King watched me with his steady, unblinking eyes, a silent guardian keeping watch over the land he had just helped defend. I walked the perimeter of the pasture, every step a reminder of the chaos Karen had unleashed. The fence near the creek sagged where someone had climbed over it. A few of my no trespassing signs were missing entirely, ripped from the posts and tossed aside. Near the north gate, I found a trail of muddy footprints leading toward the woods, proof of panicked campers cutting through the trees in their rush to escape. My anger simmered beneath the surface. This land was more than dirt and grass. It was family history, blood and sweat poured into every acre. My grandfather's voice echoed in my mind. A man's land is his word. Protect it, and you protect everything you stand for. The faint sound of tires on gravel snapped me out of my thoughts. I turned toward the driveway just in time to see a line of sheriff's vehicles crest the hill, 3 black and white SUVs and a dusty county pickup. Red and blue lights flashed silently in the daylight, washing over the torn-up meadow. Relief washed through me, followed quickly by a surge of tension. The law had finally arrived. But how would they see this? Would they side with the loud HOA president who had probably already called in complaints? Or would they understand the truth of what had happened here? The lead SUV stopped near the barn, and Sheriff Daniel Ruiz stepped out, his broad frame and steady presence instantly recognizable. Ruiz had been sheriff for more than a decade, a man known for fairness and a no-nonsense attitude. I'd met him a few times at county meetings, and I knew he respected property rights. Still, I braced myself as he approached, his boots crunching against the gravel. "Morning, Mason," Ruiz said, adjusting the brim of his hat. His sharp eyes swept over the field littered with trash and tire marks. "Looks like you had yourself quite a gathering." "That's one way to put it," I said, forcing a tight smile. "I called your office hours ago. Karen and the HOA decided my ranch was the perfect spot for their community camping festival. They invited hundreds, maybe 1,000 people. None of them had permission to be here." Ruiz raised an eyebrow. "Karen from the Lakeside HOA. The one and only," I said. "She tore down my signs, blocked the driveway, and let kids run around near the bullpen. I tried to get everyone to leave, but they wouldn't listen. I had to do something before someone got hurt." Ruiz glanced toward the barnware. King and the other bulls grazed peacefully behind the fence. "We got a few colorful calls this morning," he said slowly. "Some folks claimed you set a herd of bulls loose on them." I met his gaze without flinching. I opened the pen. "Yes, but I never sixed them on anyone. The bulls were under my control the whole time. They didn't touch a soul. I needed to scare those trespassers off before they got themselves killed or burned my pasture to the ground." Ruiz studied me for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Finally, he gave a small nod. "No injuries reported, no property outside your own damaged. Looks to me like a man protecting what's his." Before I could respond, the sound of a familiar shriek cut through the air. Karen was back. She marched toward us from the direction of the creek, mud streaking her white capris and a deep scowl carved into her face. 2 of her HOA board members trailed behind her, looking far less confident than their leader. "There he is," she shouted, pointing a shaking finger at me. "That man unleashed dangerous animals on innocent families." My guests were terrified. "He should be arrested." Ruiz turned slowly to face her, his calm demeanor a sharp contrast to her fury. Ma'am, I'll need you to lower your voice. We're conducting an investigation. Investigation, Karen scoffed. It's obvious what happened. He attacked us with bulls. Children were screaming. People could have died. I folded my arms across my chest. Children were screaming because you brought them onto private property without permission and started lighting fireworks next to livestock. I told you to leave. You refused? That's trespassing, Karen. And it's a felony when you bring this many people in, cause this much damage. Karen's face turned a deep shade of crimson. This land is community green space. The HOA map shows it clearly. Ruiz held up a hand to silence her. Ma'am, we've reviewed the county records. This ranch is private property, owned by Mason Carter. It has never been part of the Lakeside HOA. For the first time all morning, Karen faltered. Her mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. Behind her, the board members exchanged uneasy glances and began edging backward toward the driveway. Ruiz took a step closer, his voice firm. You organized an event with hundreds of people on land you do not own. You removed posted signs, blocked an access road, and caused significant property damage. Do you have any idea how serious that is? Karen's eyes darted nervously from me to the deputies now fanning out across the field to document evidence. It was just a neighborhood gathering, she stammered. Everyone thought it was harmless. Harmless? I gestured toward the meadow where deep ruts scarred the soil and half-burned fireworks lay scattered like grenades. Take a good look, Karen. This isn't harmless. It'll take weeks to repair the ground. And my bulls could have been injured or worse. Ruiz removed a notepad from his pocket and began writing. Ma'am, I'll need your full name, driver's license, and the details of everyone on your planning committee. You're facing charges of criminal trespassing, reckless endangerment, and destruction of property. Depending on the final report, there may also be civil suits for damages, Karen sputtered, her voice rising to a high-pitched wail. This is outrageous. I was trying to bring people together. You can't arrest me for that. Ruiz's expression remained neutral. You're not being arrested at this moment, but you will be cited and summoned to court. If you refuse to comply, we'll escalate. The board members behind her looked like they wanted to vanish into the earth. One of them, a thin man with a clipboard, muttered, Karen, maybe we should just cooperate. Karen shot him a glare sharp enough to cut steel. But even she seemed to realize her usual tactics wouldn't work here. With trembling hands, she dug through her oversized purse and produced her license, slapping it into Ruiz's waiting palm. While the deputies collected statements and photographed the damage, I walked the sheriff through the property, pointing out the missing signs, the trampled fence, and the scorched patches of grass near the fireworks. Ruiz took careful notes, occasionally snapping his own photos with his phone. Each time we stopped, the weight of what Karen had done sank deeper into my chest. The cleanup would take days, maybe weeks. I'd have to reseed the pasture, repair the fencing, and haul away mountains of trash. But at least now, the law was firmly on my side. When we returned to the barnyard, Karen was pacing near her SUV, her once pristine outfit streaked with mud and humiliation. Ruiz handed her a stack of citations and explained the court process in a measured tone. Karen snatched the papers, her lips pressed into a thin, furious line. You haven't heard the last of this, she hissed at me. I'll have real lawyers on you before the week is out. I met her glare with a steady calm that surprised even me. Get as many lawyers as you like. The deed is clear. The signs were clear. And the sheriff's report will be even clearer. For a long moment, Karen held my gaze, her eyes blazing with a mix of rage and defeat. Then she turned sharply on her heel and climbed into her SUV, slamming the door hard enough to rattle the frame. The engine roared to life, spitting gravel as she sped down the driveway with the two board members trailing in silent retreat. As the dust settled, Ruiz gave me a small nod of respect. You handled yourself well, Mason. Could have been a lot worse out here. Thanks for coming, I said, my voice heavy with exhaustion. I wasn't sure anyone would believe me over her. Ruiz tipped his hat. Property rights are property rights. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. We'll process these charges and keep you updated. In the meantime, document everything: photos, receipts for repairs. If she tries to sue, you'll want a paper trail a mile long. After the deputies left, the ranch felt strangely empty. The meadow, though scarred and littered, belonged to me again. I walked slowly back to the barn where King waited, his dark eyes meeting mine with quiet understanding. I reached through the fence and scratched his thick neck. We did it, buddy, I whispered. We held the line. The bulls shifted lazily, the tension of the morning replaced by the peaceful rhythm of grazing. I looked out over the battered pasture and felt a mixture of pride and sadness. My grandfather had taught me that land isn't just earth, it's a promise. And today, that promise had been tested and upheld. Karen and her mob might return with lawyers and complaints, but the ranch had spoken louder than any argument. Out here, respect wasn't granted by a committee or an HOA. It was earned, acre by acre, hoofbeat by hoofbeat. As the sun began to dip toward the western hills, I grabbed a rake and began the long process of cleaning up the mess. The work would be hard, but it was honest. And when the meadow grew green again, it would stand as proof that this land, my land, could not be stolen, no matter how loud or reckless the intruder. The moment I released the bulls, the air changed. The quiet murmur of the crowd shifted into a sharp, frantic silence. For a heartbeat, the only sound was the heavy slam of the barn gate as it swung open and echoed across the wide field. Then came the deep, thunderous snorts of my bulls. Their hooves struck the ground like distant drums, a steady, growing rumble that made the earth vibrate beneath my boots. Dust curled upward as 6 massive animals stepped into the sunlight, their muscled shoulders rippling like living machines. They were powerful, restless, and hungry for space to run. I could feel their energy like a living force, hot and electric in the cool morning air. For years, these bulls had been trained to respect my signals, and they trusted me enough to follow my lead. But to a stranger, to someone foolish enough to trespass, they were a wall of unstoppable force. Garn was the first to notice them. Her triumphant grin dissolved into a stiff, confused expression. She blinked, tilted her head, and squinted at the dark shapes stepping from the barn. "What's that?" she called out, her voice carrying a nervous laugh that didn't quite land. When the bulls snorted again, lowering their massive heads in unison, the sound cut through the chatter of the campers like a warning bell. People paused a man holding a camera stopped filming and turned. A group of kids who had been chasing a soccer ball froze slowly. The noise of the festival music, laughter, clinking beer bottles died away, until all that remained was the steady, ominous rhythm of hooves. I didn't rush them. That was the key. Bulls don't need to be forced into chaos. They simply need permission. I stepped aside, lifted my arm in a calm, deliberate gesture, and gave a single sharp clap. It was a signal they knew well. The lead bull, a dark brown giant named Tank, snorted and stamped the ground so hard it sent a ripple through the dirt. His brothers followed with a chorus of deep bellows. Then, without warning, Tank lunged forward. His muscles bunched like a coiled spring and released in a powerful leap, hooves pounding into the field with the force of a small earthquake. The reaction from the crowd was instant. A woman near the edge of the pasture screamed. A man cursed and dropped his drink, backing away so fast he tripped over his own cooler. Karen took a single step back and then another, her face draining of color as the bulls fanned out across the field. Dust exploded upward with every charge, and the air filled with the sharp, hot scent of sweat and earth. I watched as fear rippled outward through the crowd like a wave breaking on a shore. The campers didn't understand that these bulls were trained to intimidate, not attack. To them, it must have looked like pure chaos. 6 massive animals barreling toward their tents, their horns glinting in the sunlight, their eyes wide and wild. People began to run. First, a few cautious steps, then full-on panic. Chairs toppled, tables crashed, and the once orderly rows of tents turned into a tangle of fabric and rope as campers scrambled to escape. The music cut off abruptly when someone yanked the speaker's power cord. Children cried as parents snatched them up and sprinted for their cars. A group of teenagers tried to climb the wooden fence near the road, but the bulls thundered too close, forcing them to retreat in a stumbling, desperate rush. Karen's voice rose above the chaos, high and shrill. "Stop! Stop running! They're just animals," she shouted, waving her arms like she could control the stampede. But her words were swallowed by the roar of hooves and the terrified screams of her guests. She turned to me, her eyes wide and frantic. "Call them off," she demanded. "This is dangerous." I stood with my arms folded, perfectly calm. "This is my land," I said, loud enough for those nearby to hear, "and you were warned." My words carried across the field like a verdict. Karen's jaw dropped, but she said nothing more. Behind her, a man dropped a heavy cooler in his rush to escape, the ice and drinks scattering across the dirt like marbles. Someone shouted about calling the police, but another voice shouted back that the sheriff had already been notified. The crowd surged toward the driveway, a chaotic tide of people desperate to reach their cars. Tank led the charge across the field, his massive body moving with a speed that defied his size. He never aimed for the people, directly just close enough to make them scatter like startled birds. The other bulls followed suit, bellowing and stomping, kicking up clouds of dust so thick it turned the late afternoon sun into a hazy, golden fog. I could barely see the far side of the pasture, but I could hear everything. The frantic cries, the slamming of car doors, the grind of engines as vehicles skidded and spun to escape the narrow gravel road near the center of the chaos. Karen tried to regain control. She ran toward a cluster of tents, shouting at people to stay calm, but her own footing betrayed her. A rope from a half-collapsed canopy snagged her ankle, sending her sprawling face first into a patch of mud. The sound of her frustrated scream cut through the air like a sharp crack, but no one stopped to help. Her once pristine white blouse was smeared brown by the time she scrambled back to her feet, her hair streaked with dirt and sweat. I caught her eye for a brief second and saw pure panic where arrogance had once lived. Cars began to jam the single-lane driveway, engines revving, and tires spitting gravel as drivers fought to escape. A camper van swerved too sharply and ended up stuck in a ditch, its back wheels spinning helplessly in the mud. A group of young men abandoned their bicycles altogether, tossing them to the ground in their rush toward the exit. From the corner of my eye, I noticed a few people trying to carry their belongings, dragging coolers and folding chairs as if the bulls might politely wait for them to pack. A sudden bellow from Tank changed their minds instantly. They dropped everything and bolted. Through it all, my bulls remained magnificent. They ran in wide circles, their massive bodies weaving in and out of the fleeing crowd with perfect precision. They weren't enraged. They were excited. To them, this was a game of dominance, a chance to stretch their legs and claim their territory. Each time a group of campers tried to regroup, Tank would lower his head and charge just close enough to send them scattering again. It was controlled chaos, a living wall of muscle and dust that left no room for defiance. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 15 minutes, the field began to clear. The music equipment lay abandoned. Coolers, folding tables, and camping gear littered the grass like wreckage from a storm. A lone pair of sneakers sat near the fence, their owner, long gone. The air still hummed with the energy of the stampede, but the people were nearly all gone. Only a handful of stragglers remained, running toward the last of the cars as Tank let out one final bellow that echoed across the valley like a thunderclap. Karen was among the last to leave. Covered in mud and breathing hard, she staggered toward her SUV, which was wedged between two other vehicles near the edge of the field. She glanced back at me, her eyes burning with fury and something else, fear. For a second, I thought she might say something, maybe threaten a lawsuit or hurl an insult, but she said nothing. She simply climbed into her car, slammed the door, and sped away in a spray of gravel. As the last car disappeared down the driveway, silence returned to the ranch. The only sounds were the soft snorts of the bulls and the distant call of a hawk circling above. I gave a low whistle and clapped twice. Tank stopped his pacing, turning his great head toward me. Slowly, obediently, the bulls trotted back toward the barn, their sides heaving with exertion but their eyes bright with satisfaction. I scratched Tank behind the ear as he passed, rewarding him with the calm tone he knew so well. "Good job, boys," I murmured. "You earned your hay tonight." The field looked like a battlefield. Crushed tents lay scattered across the grass. Torn banners flapped weakly in the breeze. A broken lawn chair leaned crookedly against a tree. Yet beneath the mess, the land itself was untouched. My fences still stood. My home was safe. And most importantly, the trespassers were gone. I took a long breath of the evening air, letting the quiet settle deep into my chest. The bulls had done their job without harming a single soul, though they had certainly left a lasting impression. By the time the sheriff arrived, the campers would be miles away, nursing bruised egos and muddy shoes. Karen would have to explain to her neighbors why her community festival ended in a panic as the sun began to sink behind the hills. I stood in the fading light and watched the dust slowly settle over the field. Justice had been served through courts or arguments, but through the simple, undeniable power of nature. My land was mine again, and thanks to 6 unstoppable bulls, everyone who had dared to challenge that truth would remember it for a very long time. By the time the sheriff's cruisers rolled up the long gravel road, the chaos had faded into an eerie calm. The sky was turning the deep orange of late evening, and the warm glow stretched across the pastures, reflecting off the scattered debris left behind by Karen's ill-fated festival. My bulls were back in their pen, snorting contentedly as they chewed on fresh hay. Tank raised his head when he heard the engines, but remained calm, his great chest rising and falling in slow, steady breaths. He knew the job was finished. All that remained was the reckoning. 2 deputies stepped out of the first cruiser, brushing dust from their uniforms as they surveyed the mess. Their boots crunched over crushed soda cans and trampled patches of grass. Behind them, a third vehicle followed, its lights flashing in the dimming light. The officers exchanged quick looks as they took in the field, tents half collapsed, folding chairs overturned, a banner that read Neighborhood Camping Festival hanging crookedly from a fence post. It looked less like a party and more like the aftermath of a small tornado. "Evening, sir," the lead deputy said as he approached me. His eyes swept over the wreckage before settling on my face. "We got a call about a disturbance and possible trespassing. Are you the property owner?" "Yes, I am," I replied, pulling the folded deed from my back pocket. I had it ready hours ago, anticipating exactly this moment. "Name's Luke Carter. This land's been in my family for 3 generations. And before you ask, I didn't invite anyone here. The woman responsible is Karen Nichols, president of the Valley Pines HOA. She brought at least 1,000 people onto my land without permission." The deputy nodded, his expression tightening as he glanced toward the road where faint tire tracks still lined the dirt. "We passed a lot of cars leaving in a hurry," he said. "Looked like a full-on evacuation." "That's one way to describe it," I said dryly. "I warned her to leave. She refused. Then she found out my bulls don't take kindly to strangers." One of the other deputies raised an eyebrow, clearly noticing the size of the animals grazing calmly behind the barn. "Those bulls of yours," he said carefully, "they didn't hurt anyone, did they?" "Nope," I answered. "They just made sure everyone understood what a no trespassing sign really means." The deputies exchanged a look that was half amusement and half admiration. The lead officer let out a low whistle and shook his head. "Well, from what we've seen on the way in, I'd say your bulls got the message across. Now, about Ms. Nichols, did she identified herself to you during all this?" "She sure did," I said, handing over a printed email Karen had foolishly sent to the entire HOA board. It was an open invitation to the Big Valley Pines Community Camping Festival, complete with directions to my property and a cheery note, claiming the ranch was shared land for all neighbors to enjoy. The deputy scanned the paper, his jaw tightening with each line. "This is blatant," he said finally, folding the email with a crisp snap. "This isn't just trespassing. This is criminal mischief and reckless endangerment. She organized a mass gathering on private property without consent. And from what I can tell, she removed posted signs. She ripped them right off the fence," I confirmed. "I've got the bent nails to prove it." The deputy nodded and turned to his team. "Let's get statements and photos. We'll track her down tonight." As the officers moved across the field, snapping pictures of the damage and collecting abandoned items for evidence, I felt the tightness in my chest finally begin to ease. For hours I had carried the weight of anger, frustration, and worry. Now, standing in the fading light, I allowed myself to breathe deeply. The land was scarred but safe. No one had been hurt. Justice was finally stepping in to back up the power of my bulls. About an hour later, the sound of tires crunching gravel returned. A dark SUV pulled into the driveway, its headlights cutting through the deepening dusk. My stomach tightened as I recognized the vehicle. Karen, she had returned. Perhaps believing she could smooth things over or twist the story before the law closed in, she climbed out of the car wearing fresh clothes. Though her hair was still a tangled mess and faint streaks of mud clung to her shoes, her usual air of superiority was dimmed but not gone. Karen approached the deputies with a forced smile that looked more like a grimace. "Officers," she began, her voice trembling with fake charm, "I'm so glad you're here. This man unleashed dangerous animals on my guests. He put lives at risk. I demand that he be arrested." The deputies turned to her in unison. The lead officer, a tall man with a weathered face, held up the printed email. "Ms. Nichols, we've reviewed the evidence. You organized a large gathering on private property without permission. You removed posted signs, allowed open fires, and created a hazardous situation. You are the one facing charges tonight." Karen's smile froze, her eyes widening in disbelief. "Charges against me? No. You don't understand. This land is part of the community. It's on the old maps." "Those maps are outdated," the deputy said firmly. "The current deed is clear. This ranch belongs entirely to Mr. Carter. You had no right to bring anyone here. You'll be cited for criminal trespassing, destruction of property, and reckless endangerment. You're lucky no one was hurt, or this would be far worse." Karen's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. Her face flushed crimson as the reality settled in. "Buddy said bulls on us," she sputtered. "That has to be illegal." The deputy's eyes hardened. His animals remained on his property at all times. They didn't injure anyone. They were in their legal enclosure until you trespassed. Your actions provoked this incident, Ms. Nichols. You are entirely responsible. For once, Karen had no comeback. Her shoulders sagged as the deputies read her rights and escorted her to the waiting cruiser. She sputtered half-hearted protests as they guided her into the back seat, but the fight was gone from her voice. As the door closed with a heavy thunk, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. The woman who had turned my peaceful ranch into a war zone was finally facing the consequences she had brought upon herself. After the cruisers left, the night grew quiet again. The stars began to prick the darkening sky, each one sharp and brilliant against the velvet black. I stood in the center of the empty field and let the cool night air fill my lungs. My boots crunched softly over the dry grass as I walked toward the barn. Tank and the other bulls greeted me with low, satisfied rumbles. I patted their broad shoulders, feeling the warmth of their massive bodies. "Good work, boys," I said softly. "You did exactly what you were raised to do, protect what's ours." Tank lowered his head, letting me scratch the rough patch of fur between his horns. The others stood close, their breath steaming in the cool air. They were calm now, their energy spent, but their presence still carried an unmistakable strength. In the following days, the HOA board scrambled to distance themselves from Karen's reckless stunt. Official letters of apology arrived, though none were as satisfying as the sight of her being driven away in the back of a cruiser. Local news outlets picked up the story, dubbing it the Great Bull Stampede, and neighbors stopped by to share their support. Some even brought pies and casseroles as a quiet way of saying, "Good job, Luke." The sheriff later informed me that Karen faced heavy fines, a suspended HOA presidency, and multiple civil suits from neighbors whose cars had been damaged in the panic. Word spread quickly, and not a single soul dared to set foot on my land without permission again. My ranch returned to the peaceful sanctuary it had always been, a place of quiet mornings, grazing bulls, and sunsets so beautiful they looked like paintings. One evening, as I leaned on the fence watching Tank and his brothers graze under the twilight sky, I thought back to the moment I first saw those tents crowding my field. I remembered the anger and the helplessness, but now, all I felt was gratitude for the land, for the bulls, and for the justice that had been served without a single drop of unnecessary blood. Sometimes the best defense isn't words or fists or even the law. Sometimes it's the simple, undeniable truth of nature itself. The ranch was mine again, and it would stay that way. For more jaw-dropping real-life stories like this, like, share, comment, and subscribe to Bright Reality on YouTube. Your next shocking story is just one click away, don't miss it.